On the 4th of July 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted in a land formerly ruled by the British across the Atlantic from them. This declared that these colonies would no longer be under British rule, but instead a series of states united as one in land that for centuries at this point had been referred to as America. It was on this day that the earliest form of the United States of America was formed, and just under 250 years later, the land of the free is still celebrating it as their Independence Day, with fireworks, parades, and a lot of red, white, and blue flags. The US was founded on this idea that anyone from around the world could come and find a new life for themselves. This is perfectly seen in the multitude of languages which now call the land home. While the country is home to a huge array of indigenous tongues like Cree, Cherokee, and Navajo, just to name three, it's tongues that have migrated to this land, which are way more dominant. Of course, English is the most widely spoken language of the USA, thanks to the country's past of being a British colony. Beyond English, meanwhile, other tongues have been imported to the country too, like Spanish and Mandarin, which have gained strongholds across the country too. Though what's equally interesting are the smaller pockets of different languages found in specific parts of the states. And one of the most well-known examples of this has to be the French, spoken in Louisiana. This southern state is deeply linked with the tongue of France, so much so that Louisiana French is actually considered its own unique form of the language. Featuring words from other languages is interacted with. Louisiana French gave us words like gumbo and bayou, which come from Bantu and indigenous origins respectively. Even certain letters make different sounds when compared to the sounds they make in French spoken in France too. Louisiana French isn't technically a single language, but instead a collection of even smaller versions spoken within the state. Collectively, there are over 70,000 people who are able to speak this version of French, meaning the tongue is alive and well in the state. You may presume that French arrived in Louisiana the same way English did, via people from France migrating here and setting up shop. In reality, there is only one part of this story. The French did rule the roost in this part of the USA for some time. At its peak, their New France claim spanned from what we now call Canada all the way down to here. It's why the state is called Louisiana, as it was named after French King Louis XIV. Yet this specific version of French that flourished in the state only really started to appear after France lost the land. This means that French's migration to Louisiana was not done in a single trip. The tongue ended up in the Deep South, not directly from France, but instead from somewhere else in the New World that French had made its home in, that being a region known as Acadia. This was a French colony founded in 1604 and was located in modern Canada's maritime provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. While the colony no longer technically exists, the region is still sometimes referred to as Acadia, and its residents as Acadian, the same name its residents had when the colony was definitively a thing. With a colony founded, France needed people to actually live in the place, and it tempted those from France to make the trip to this region with the promise of land and riches. These would eventually come to those who made the trip, but it involved having to abandon their cozy lives in France for the harsh weather and terrain that Canada had to offer. Acadia's early adopters braved this wilderness, and over time, the colony came to be one of the most idyllic and pleasant that New France had to offer. It became so affluent that the residents of Acadia were even accused of being lazy by others in the land. Acadia would remain a French colony all the way until 1713. It was in this year that Queen Anne's War broke out between France and Britain, with the British coming out on the winning side. This resulted in Acadia becoming a British colony, something that made the French speakers of the land somewhat nervous. To begin with, however, relations between the French-speaking Acadians and their new British rulers started smoothly. The British had just claimed their home. The last thing they wanted to do was get on the bad side of their new subjects. The British allowed the Acadians to carry on speaking French and generally go about their lives. This was all well and good, but as the years went on, tensions grew not with Britain and Acadia directly, but between Britain and France itself. These two nations have historically been at each other's throats. Of course, relations would be patched in the future with them being allies in the world wars, but that was still centuries off at this point. As the French became bitter enemies of the British, it led to Britain having a general distaste for all things French. This included the French-speaking population of their Acadia colony in modern Canada. Britain wanted to remove all traces of France in land under their rule. This culminated for the Acadians in 1755 in an event known as Le Grand Dérangement, which in English means the Great Disturbance or the Great Upheaval. It was also simply known as the Expulsion of the Acadians. As the many names of this event implies, this was the forcible removal of the French-speaking Acadians at the hands of the British. Their homes were destroyed, their crops burnt to the ground, families separated, and countless lives lost. These were wealthy, educated people who all of a sudden had their entire worlds flipped upside down. With their peaceful lives stolen from them in an instant, they now found themselves as exiles with little to nothing to their names. Those who managed to get out of Acadia were looked down upon by the British, who by this point ruled a large part of North America. They were treated as second-class citizens and even sold into slavery. What this meant for those not killed or enslaved was that they had to find a new home for themselves, somewhere in this huge, not fully comprehended land, which was now slowly being taken over by other European powers, who had a general distaste for them too. This meant finding a new home was tough for many, as these other European-ruled areas wanted nothing to do with them. The Acadians needed somewhere in the land they could call their own, where they wouldn't be treated as subhuman and could hide away from those who looked down on them. This led to many Acadians over the decades wandering further and further from the land which was once their home. By the 1760s, a group of exiled Acadians had travelled so far from Acadia, they found themselves by the Gulf of Mexico. That's around 2,000 miles away from their original home. At this time, the land was under Spanish rule, but despite this, there were still regions in which they could hide away and be left to their own devices. One of those places being the river delta of the Mississippi. This was a truly unforgiving part of the Americas, composed of thick swampland, full to the brim with mosquitoes and alligators. By all means, it was completely inhospitable, but in the eyes of Acadians, it was perfect. The harshness of the land meant they could live here without interference from the likes of the British or Spanish. The only other people living here were those indigenous people who called the land home for centuries prior to the arrival of any Europeans. It was here this group of Acadians found their new home. They learned to master the land, not only how to survive here, but thrive, learning to live off what the region had to offer and form a new life. The region even acquired the name of the Bayou, a word as previously mentioned which derived from a native language. This set in motion the language of French, one deeply linked to the cosmopolitan and sophisticated image of France, being spoken in the depths of America amongst the swamps and gators of Louisiana. And from here it expanded and changed into that unique version of French dubbed Louisiana French that thousands speak to this day. It wasn't just the language which changed and expanded, however. As the Acadians thrived in the Bayou, they too evolved. Over the generations, they went from well-to-do farmers living the life of Riley in Canada to toughened people able to live in one of the USA's harshest environments. They even underwent a name change too. Over the years, and thanks to the changes in the language they spoke, the name of Acadian morphed into something else entirely. The A at the start was dropped completely, making them the Cadians, and eventually the D and part at the end was flattened out into a more simple sound, which just sounded like jeune. The name went from Acadian to Cadian to Cajun. Yeah, the Cajun people, whose culture, language, accent, and of course food, are some of Louisiana's most well-known of cultural identifiers, are the descendants of French Canadians who were forced out their home by the British centuries ago. It's an incredible story of how people and language can thrive and find a new home under the harshest of circumstances and the toughest of terrains. And this is the story of how French arrived in Louisiana. First, they found a home in a small region of modern Canada, and from there the people and their tongues migrated again. Not out of their own choice, but due to the horrendous circumstances they had little to no control over. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the USA is a country built on immigrants, and the idea that anyone can arrive in the land and make something out of themselves. And in many ways, the story of the Acadians becoming the Cajuns and taking French to the deep south is a prime example of that concept, and something definitely worth knowing about during the many celebrations that occur across the country during the 4th of July. It's also an incredible story of a language migrating to a new home and finding roots there. This is something I find supremely interesting, and I've covered other cases of languages migrating, like this one in other videos, like Welsh finding a home in Argentina, or Polish becoming widely spoken in England, or the huge journey the Turkish language undertook to find its home in modern Turkey. I love sharing these stories with you all, and seemingly many of you enjoy them too. If you're one of these people who are deeply interested in these stories of immigrant tongues, then I have some very exciting news coming your way. Stay tuned for a special announcement video coming out this Sunday. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/Name Explain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm Name Explain YT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.